Toastmasters and guests, do you believe in fate? Listen to this story. Father and son were playing chess. Mother was sitting by the fireside knitting. It was a cold and wet evening and the wind was shaking the window panes. Suddenly they heard the sound of the gate opening and heavy footsteps towards the door, followed by a loud knocking. Mr. White immediately got up from his game to open the door and greet the guest. The guest walked in. Mr. White announced, "Sergeant Major Morris." Sergeant Major Morris came inside, shook hands with the family and took a seat by the fireside. Immediately Mr. White ran and picked up glasses and a bottle of whiskey for his guest and poured the guest a drink. Sergeant Morris started sipping the whiskey and the sparkle in his eye, and he smiled. Mr. White said, "Sergeant Morris has just returned from a long tour of duty in India, and he has come to visit us and to tell us about the tales from this country." Mrs. White was thrilled. She says, "That is fascinating. I've always wanted to visit India." Sergeant Major Morris's tone was not very friendly. He said, "Better where you are." Mr. White said, Didn't you tell me that day in the pub about something called the Monkeys Paw?" Sergeant Major Morris said, "Yes." He reached into his duffel bag and he pulled out the monkey's paw. It was a small mummified paw of a monkey, long dead. He said, "This is a magical paw." At the word magical, the small family circle immediately leaned forward to look at the paw. He said, "A very holy man in India called a fakir has put a spell on this paw." The fakir said that man's life is ruled by fate, and any man who does not follow this will have bad consequences. He said, "What is so special about the paw?" asked Mrs. White. Sergeant Major Morris said, "Person who owns the paw will get 3 wishes. At this, the family found it very amusing. What a tall tale, 3 wishes. But Sergeant Major Morris's tone was very serious. He said, "It came into my possession from the previous owner who passed away. I don't know what his first 2 wishes were, but his last wish was for death." And then Sergeant Major Morris became very silent. And all of a sudden, he threw the paw into the fireplace. The family was shocked. Immediately, the young Mr. White picked up the paw and took it in his hands, pulled it out of the fire. Sergeant Morris says, "Leave it in the fire. You should have let it burn." Young Herbert said, "If you don't want it, let us keep it." Sergeant Morris was clear, but the consequences is up to you if you keep this paw. Mr. White asked curiously, "So how do you make this wish?" Sergeant Major said, "Just hold it in your hand and wish." At this point, Mrs. White says, "It's time for supper." And so they kept the paw on the mantelpiece of the fireplace and they went for supper. A little later, the guest had left with a warning not to use the paw. But the family was very curious. They gathered by the fireplace and Mr. White took the paw in his hands. He says, "What shall I wish for?" Young Herbert says, "Why don't you wish to become an emperor with riches?" Mrs. White is more practical. She says, "Why don't you just wish for 200 pounds which we need to fix the roof?" So Mr. White said, "Okay, I'll wish for 200 pounds. And he stood in front of the fireplace. He says, "I wish for 200 pounds. Ah! He left it. It moved," he said. "It moved." Mrs. White said, what nonsense, you're imagining things. Young Herbert picked up the paw. He says, it's dead. What is there? He said, no, it really moved. At this, the family were a little wondering what had actually happened, but they decided to call it a day, and they left, went upstairs to bed. The very next day, noon, there's a knock on the door, a gentle knock on the door. Mr. White goes, opens the door. A guest comes in, a very scared looking, timid looking man who is looking around very nervous. He greets Mr. and Mrs. White. He says, I am from Paw and Noggins. I am afraid there has been an accident. Mrs. White says, what? Our Herbert, is he okay? The gentleman says, I am sorry ma'am, he has been injured. He says, but is he in any pain? He says, no ma'am, he is in no pain anymore. At this, Mrs. White shrieks, oh my God! And Mr. White face turns white and he is stunned. The visitor pulls out a small envelope from his pocket and says, we at Paw and Noggins are truly sorry for this terrible tragedy. And as a token of our support, we would like to give you this towards the funeral. Mr. White, still stunned, takes the envelope in his hand, opens it. In it is a check for £200. Thank you.